Hey YouTube viewers, this is Donnie Smith and welcome to another Eastwood video series. You can learn more about our friends at Eastwood by clicking right here. Now in the past videos we have went through the steps on this Mustang. We have taken the parts off, showed you how to disassemble a car. We've done the body work, we've done glaze work, and we've prepped the car. We've got it ready for primer, surfacer, and paint. So in this video we're going to show you the steps to mask the car to get it ready for primer, how to apply a self-etch primer and primer surfacer. Now before we get started, I wanted to talk about checking new parts. Now ideally, before you ever even start on the car, start the repairs, you want to check parts and make sure that they fit properly. However, on this build, we went ahead and got started on it before the rear bumper came in. And the rear bumper is the only part that we are replacing on this, and it's an aftermarket part. So you want to make certain that you get the part, you put it up there, maybe even bolt it on, make sure that it's going to fit, because the last thing you want is to start sanding it or maybe even get it painted, or maybe not even realize something's wrong that doesn't fit after, when you're trying to get the car ready to be completed. So as soon as new parts come in, be certain to check, proper fit. So that'll give you the time, if it is the wrong part, you can get the right part ordered and it's not going to jeopardize, the car being late right at the last minute, or maybe having the part painted and you can't return it, things like that. So check that first. That could save you time in the end. Now in our case, we checked this rear bumper cover, we put it up there, it fit good, so we had no problems. We could go ahead and continue our repairs as planned. Okay, so now we have the car prepped, and now we're ready to apply some primer surfacer. Now what primer surfacer is, it's like a thin filler that sprays on with a spray gun. You apply it on there and it helps fill imperfections. And this really only needs to be applied anywhere that we feather edged and you have the different layers of paint. If you don't prime that, you might see a little ring where that was at. So you want to prime any feather edged areas. And you may have had to feather edge your bodywork out, where you had sand scratches. Rock chips may have to have been feathered out, or if there's any key scratches or things like that that need to be feathered out. Another reason is anywhere you do body work, you want to apply primer surface over any body filler or glaze putty that you may have applied. But it's really not necessary to apply a primer surfacer on the entire car. And I think that's kind of misunderstood out there, and a lot of people think that you have to apply primer surfacer over the entire car. But if you remember correctly, we've already, in previous videos, we have blocked this entire car out. And if there was some very minor imperfections, we use the coatings that were on there to block that out, to kind of act like a primer surfacer to block that out. I mean, you have 4 to 6 mils from the factory, of your base coat and clear coat and all your undercoatings. Use that to block out. If it blocks out fine, then you're in good shape. You don't need to apply additional primer surfacer just to give you something to sand down again. Now there are some exceptions to that, like restoration. If you do restoration work and you sandblast the whole car, stripped it down. In those cases, you may want to go ahead and apply primer surface over the entire car and then block the entire car down. But remember this, anywhere you apply primer surfacer, it has to be sanded. So if you already final sanded the entire car and you apply primer surfacer, guess what? You have got to sand that entire car again. So the reason I talk about where we're going to apply primer surfacer, because you want to have an idea, a very good idea of what you're going to prime before you start masking, because you want to mask off areas that you don't want primer overspray to get on. Now, one of the things I've seen a lot, and I'm sure you've seen it too, is where you mask off a square around the repair area. And that really is not a good practice to do, because that leaves hard edges. And I'll tell you why they do that a lot of times. Because they didn't sand out here, and they don't want their primer overspray to get on the unsanded area. Because that may happen sometimes. You get primer over here and it wasn't sanded, and then you block it all out and didn't realize that you didn't sand all that primer back off of the unsanded paint. And then later you're going to lose adhesion and it's going to start peeling because that primer didn't adhere properly to the paint. So to prevent that, they put that square around there to prevent from primer surfacer getting on the unsanded paint. Well, the way that we do this, the way I've explained in these previous videos, we don't have to worry about that. Because if you remember correctly, we've already prepped the entire panel. So if we was needing to prime an area like this, but we accidentally get a little bit further than we intended with our primer surfacer, that's okay because it's sanded. It's not going to peel. It's not going to lose adhesion. Now the problem with these hard edges, those squares that you see, is it takes a lot of extra time and effort to sand those edges. And I've even seen it before where you sand that edge completely gone. You can't even see it. It's, you know, feathered in good to the paint. And then you paint it and you can see where that square was at. You know, it may not be real noticeable, but you look in the right angle and you can see that line. You know, that's something you don't want. You want that show quality. You want a professional looking job. So try to avoid any hard lines by masking around the damaged area. So what we're going to do is to prevent that, we're going to back mask around our edges, and then we're going to let the overspray feather into our sanded surface. That way we for sure do not have those hard lines. When priming, you want to eliminate any primer surfacer getting on jams, you know, inside of your doors, inside of your hood, you know, places like that. And that's where we really want to put that back mask. Then we can stick our paper on that tape to further mask it back. Because if you get primer surfacer inside of jams and things like that, especially if you're not even painting the jams, you know, that's going to be hard to get off. And it's going to save a lot of time just to mask up front and make sure that all jams, gaps, things like that are masked off properly. You want to make sure all moldings are masked off, glass, tires, things like that, so you're not having to try to clean up overspray later. And it's also kind of difficult sometimes whenever we're priming like this, because we're not priming the whole car, so we may have a spot on the door and a spot on the roof, and you know, we may have just areas all over the car that we need to mask off. So it's not like you can just, you know, like you're masking a fender off, you know, just to spray the whole fender. So, you know, it may take some time to make sure that you got everything covered properly, but still allowed to spray the damaged area without having any hard edges. But this is really going to save time to do it all at once like this, you know, rather than fixing one dent and priming it, and then fixing another dent and priming that. Now, that may be a method that you have to follow if you're DIY, doing it one section at a time. You know, maybe you don't have a facility where you can leave it inside. You know, if you pull it out, that metal is going to start rusting. So if that's the case, you may want to do one damaged area at a time. But in our case, we're inside this shop facility, so we have the luxury of being able to get all of our body work done and then mask off for all of our prime areas and prime at one time. And in the end, this is going to save a lot of time and effort. Okay, now we got it all masked off. Now what we want to do is go and look at each of these damaged areas and see if there's any metal. If there is, you're going to need to apply, you know, self-etch primer, epoxy primer, or a direct-to-metal primer. Now what we chose to do, we just had several small metal spots showing. So we just got the spray can, the Eastwood spray can self-etch primer. Now what self-etch is, it's a primer that has acid in it. It bites into the metal and it provides corrosion protection. And I prefer that if I have small burn-throughs, you know, just small metal spots showing. Now if I had sandblasted this or stripped it down to metal or had a lot big metal spots showing, you know, I would probably, just my preference, rather prefer epoxy. But in this case, you know, just the small spots, we put the self-etch, allowed it to flash, and then we could apply our primer surfacer. Now let me tell you, stop and talk about flash just for a minute in case you're kind of wondering what I'm talking about. The flash time, basically all that is how long you wait between one coat and another. So for example, we allowed it to flash 10 to 15 minutes before applying the primer surfacer. So we allowed it to dry for 10 to 15 minutes. Now you also got to keep in mind, if the technical data sheet says 10 minutes, you know, that's usually in laboratory conditions, maybe around 70 degrees. So if it's 60 degrees in your shop, well, 10 minutes is not going to be enough. You're going to have to allow that dry just a little bit longer. On the other hand, if it's 100 degrees, it's probably going to dry a little faster. So you got to kind of keep that in mind as well. But self-etch primer has the acid in it, and so you got to be careful. That acid, you know, it can attack some of the coatings underneath, so you don't want to put that on too wet. You just want to dust a couple of light coats on. If you put it on too wet, it may attack those coatings and you may have some wrinkling. So we'll just apply light coats, and that way you'll be a lot safer and not take the risk of of wrinkling some of your undercoatings. Okay, we applied a couple light coats of self-etch primer, allowed it to flash. Now you don't have to sand the self-etch. You allow it to flash the recommended time, and then now you can mix up your primer surfacer and apply it right on top of that without sanding or anything like that. So we got our primer surfacer mixed up, and we're using Eastwood's 2K urethane primer surfacer on this. And this specific primer surfacer mixes 4 parts primer surfacer to 1 part catalyst. But that's going to vary with the product that you're using, the brand that you're using. So make sure before you use any product to always look at the technical data sheet. And wherever you buy your paint supplies, you should be able to ask them, do you have the technical data sheet for this product? And they should supply you with those. Now on this Eastwood primer, I've got all that for you down in the description. If you go down in the description, look, and I'll have a link where it says primer surfacer technical data sheet, and I'll have a link going to that. Now I look for a technical data sheet for the self-etch primer. I couldn't find one, but I do have a link that gives more information, so you can click on that to learn more as well. So we applied 3 coats of this primer surfacer, allowing it to flash in between each coat the recommended time. We applied 3 coats, and now we can allow it to dry. Again, look at your sheet to tell you how long it should dry before sanding. Maybe 3 hours, maybe 6, something like that, depending on the brand you're using. But me personally, I like to allow a little extra time just to make sure that it is dried, because what this can lead to, sometimes, if you get your primer on there, especially if you rush the flash times, well, them solvents are evaporating. And if you sand it before all the solvents have evaporated, it may look good, but it's still evaporating. So as it does, that primer is actually going to sink down in the scratches again. You may not notice that until after it's painted, and you get it painted, and it may even may look good right after you painted it, and after all the solvents evaporate, you notice that there's some sand scratches, and that's something you don't want. So personally, me, I'm not a production shop, and production shop don't have this luxury, but I like to allow things to dry overnight if possible. If it says 3 hours, if I've got time, I like to allow it to dry the next day before I start sanding. And if possible, I recommend that you allow it to dry at least a day or even more before block sanding. And remember, anywhere you apply primer surfacer has to be sanded. And we'll talk more about that in the next upcoming video, and we'll go through the steps of getting it block sanded and ready for paint. So thanks for watching this video. If you liked this video, be sure and give us a thumbs up, give us a like, and we'll see you in the next video.